Welcome, fellow chill seekers, to Lady Grimm, where the veil between our world and the unknown grows thin. I am your guide through these chilling tales. Take a deep breath and get comfortable, for we're about to descend into the abyss. Welcome to Lady Grimm, where the paranormal comes alive. I don't like it when the bus is late in the mornings. It's not because I'm the only pickup at my stop or that it's still dark out. Those are normal things out here in the sticks. What I don't like is that for the past few weeks, something has been watching me from the edge of the woods whenever my bus is running late. It stays crouched down, but I can feel it watching me, and it's been getting closer. I know because the smell of death is getting closer. From what I've been able to see with quick glimpses, it's pale and has long legs and arms. I can't even tell if it's wearing clothes because it seems to blend with the trees so well. It is human-shaped, but the proportions are all wrong. At least that's what I think. When I smell it, I watch the edge of the woods. The branches will move and I hear the leaves rustle. It moves low to the ground, so I know it's trying to stay hidden. I'd like to say I'm not scared or that it's my imagination, but it's not. And I know if I tell anyone, I'm gonna sound crazy. So I don't. I just hope that my bus is on time. I've also been waiting until the last minute before I might be late to leave my house in the mornings. I dread that dark morning walk down our long dirt road to the bus stop. Our house is surrounded by woods, and until this thing started watching me, I loved the woods. But now, that thing could be anywhere. My stepbrother Chris came home from college for Thanksgiving and teased me for locking the door when I got home from school. Out here, it's normal to leave your doors unlocked, and until I started seeing that thing by the bus stop, I never locked them either. But now I'm the only one that locks the doors. I hesitated for a moment, but Chris and I were always close. I told him about the thing at the bus stop, and his face went white. "It's still there?" His voice shook. "I started seeing it when I was your age, out in the trees. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. No chance. The first time I heard it out there, I threw rocks towards the trees. It smelled so bad, I thought it was a bear. I got this sharp pain in my head, and then the next thing I saw was the bus driver trying to wake me up. He said his headlights caught something moving into the trees, and then he saw me on the ground, but whatever it was had disappeared. After that, I tried ignoring it because it freaked me out so much. Week after week, it kept getting closer. I remember turning my back to it, staring away from the trees and hearing it moving behind me. It was like a skittering sound, and it would move forward and stop, move forward and stop. This went on for weeks, and the smell, it was unbearable. When it finally got so close, I could almost taste its stench. It vanished. And then I stopped seeing it. I thought I was going crazy. It's the most terrifying thing I've ever been through. Chris drove back to school on the Sunday before school started for me, and I felt relieved that I had told him. Now at least I had a plan. All I had to do was not turn around, not look at it, and then this thing in the woods should go away on its own. That next day, I left my house just on time to make it to the bus stop. I didn't want to wait any longer than I had to, but as I walked fast down my dirt driveway in the dark, I felt a tiny bit braver, even hopeful. As I reached the bus stop, I checked my watch. The bus was late again. I turned my back to the woods. It was already there. I knew because I didn't hear it coming through the trees, only heard a light rustle as I approached. Also, I knew it from the smell, the putrid smell of rot and death. As I stood perfectly still, I heard twigs crack as it moved, and the smell got stronger. It was moving towards me and getting closer. I could hear my heart in my ears, and every cell in my body wanted to run. I just wanted to get away before it reached me. But I stood my ground, remembering what Chris said. This was how I could make it go away for good. And just like Chris said, it moved forward and stopped, moved forward and stopped. I could hear it now just behind me. It was a sound like panting, but more wet, like a gurgle. It was so close. I shut my eyes hard and waited for it to turn and go back into the woods. I felt the pain in my head and fell to the ground. That pain in my head was unbearable, and I heard my scalp tearing as I struggled to open my eyes. My shoulder was on fire. There was something in my shoulder, and I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. The stench was so thick, I wanted to vomit. I was moving, but not on my own. Something was dragging me by my hair and shoulder through the woods. I turned my eyes to see a long barb sticking through my shoulder, tearing through my skin. It was green and jagged like an arrow. I could feel the points tearing inside my shoulder as it pulled. I followed it up to see that it was the creature's tail. Long, pale legs were moving fast, dragging me forward, farther into the woods than I had ever been. In these last horrific moments, I wondered if things would have been different if the bus had just been on time. I wasn't sure if I wanted the thing or if it would even fit in the car, but I knew my husband Sean would want it. He had started a DIY YouTube channel about restoring old furniture he'd find at garage sales or on the side of the road. I was finally developing an eye for the kinds of pieces he liked to feature, and this was definitely something he'd like. It was an old-school vanity with a matching chair, the kind where you'd sit and put on makeup or do your hair. I was surprised nobody had come along and picked it up. Being a good urban termite means being in the right place at the right time. I pulled the thing to the curb, leaned it over the edge of my trunk, and pushed. It was real wood, which meant it was antique for sure. My husband was going to love working on this one. I stuffed the chair into the remaining space in my trunk. I closed the door and looked up at the house. This was a nice neighborhood, full of older, established homes. Nothing like our small house on the edge of town. But this one was overgrown and tired looking. It looked empty, really. Maybe somebody had passed on and there had been an estate sale. The vanity may have been left over and not worth the trouble of selling elsewhere. It's always strange to me when people discard things that have value. I grew up poor and have always struggled to make ends meet. We don't throw things away. We find uses for them or modify them or another purpose. Hence the DIY channel. I drove to our house and pulled the vanity and chair from the car and brought it indoors. The only space we had for it in our small house was in the bedroom. I put it against the wall facing the bed. When my husband came home and saw it, he was impressed. It was a beautiful set. He was also amazed that someone had tossed out what looked like a valuable antique. That night, I looked at the vanity before going to sleep. It felt out of place in our house. It was far fancier than anything we would have been able to afford, and I went to sleep happy I'd found it. A few hours later, I woke up to feel my husband grabbing my arm tightly. His grip was so tight, I almost didn't hear the creaking sound. I turned over to see him wide-eyed, leaning far back towards the headboard. He was staring straight ahead. I turned towards the sound of the wooden vanity at our feet to see something climbing out of the mirror and onto the floor. It was twisting and contorting. We could hear its limbs dragging on the floor and felt the push as its hands clutched the edge of our blankets. As it rose at the foot of the bed, we could see her more clearly now. The grotesque figure was a ghost-like rotting woman, her decaying flesh hanging from her bones in tattered shreds. The stench of decay was suffocating. Her empty eyes fixed on me, then my husband. We were paralyzed, all our muscles tense, but still unable to move. She lurched sideways and dragged herself towards the open bedroom door. We watched her take 3 slow steps into the dark hallway, and then everything went silent. We scrambled from the bed, my husband running towards the door. He looked down the short hallway to the front door. There was nothing there. We turned all the lights on in the house and searched together. Whatever she was, whatever she wanted, she was gone now. We hauled the vanity onto the curb that night. It was gone by morning. When I was 10, I started letting myself in after school because my parents finished work at 4 and I got home around 2:45. I was always a responsible kid, and I would make myself a snack and then start my homework. I was allowed to game after finishing my homework if I was done before dinner. Since being left alone in the house, I've heard a voice calling my name from my grandmother's old bedroom. She lived with us until she had to go into hospice care before she passed. We were very close, and I miss her terribly. I thought maybe I was imagining her voice because I missed her so much. When I first heard it, it was comforting, familiar, but then it seemed to change. Now the voice coming from her bedroom is strange, like my grandmother's, but more like a deep echo. I was too scared to go into her old room while I was home alone. I never heard the voice when my mom and dad were home, only when I was alone. I asked my parents if they ever heard voices in the house, and they looked at me funny and said no. Sometimes when I hear the voice, I go to her room and stand outside with my ear to the door, listening. It gets very quiet, and there's no movement sounds. As I listen, with my face pressed against the door, I'll hear my name again, and now it's just inches away from me on the other side of that thin door. I jump and run across the hall to my room. My grandmother was one of the kindest people I've ever known, so it didn't make sense to me that she'd do anything to scare me. I kept thinking about her and wished I knew why she was calling to me. It reminded me of when I was very young, we'd play hide and seek together. I thought to myself that maybe it was some sort of game like that. The next time I was alone and heard the voice calling my name, I went down the hall and leaned against the door, my ear pressed close, listening. "Come and find me." The voice crept from the other side, eerily drawing me in, as if it was imitating something human. The words hung in the air. sending shivers down my spine. I turned and ran back across the hallway to my room, closing my door until my parents came home. After a few months of hearing this voice coming from inside my grandmother's old bedroom, I finally worked up the courage to go into the room. I needed to know why she was calling me. I was still scared, so I waited until my family was home to do it. I was getting ready for bed, and I could hear my parents talking downstairs. I walked across the hallway from my bedroom and put my hand on the doorknob. My hand was so sweaty, I almost couldn't turn the knob. I inched the door open and reached for the light switch. I opened the door about halfway and saw all my grandmother's things. My mom still hadn't packed them up. She was still heartbroken too. I stepped inside and saw her old, soft blanket at the foot of her bed and the jigsaw puzzle she had been working on before she got sick. There were no voices here now, just memories. I started crying softly and sat on her bed. I could still smell her perfume in the room, and I closed my eyes and put my head in my hands. I really missed her. After a few minutes, I got off the bed and went to the door, and as I reached for the light switch, the closet caught my eye. It was open, but it had been closed when I entered the room. I quickly shut the door and went back to my room across the hall. I closed my door and crawled into bed. I could hear the muffled sounds of my parents talking downstairs. And then another sound. The voice from the bedroom was here, in my room, and it was calling me to follow. I looked up to see the closet door opening slowly. What came out was not my grandmother. If you enjoyed that story, I'm glad you found me. I tell creepy stories about scary encounters and paranormal events. If this is your thing too, stay, listen, and subscribe to Lady Grimm for more stories. It's okay to keep the lights on. Let me tell you another story. One winter break, back when I was still in college, I went home to see my mom in Massachusetts. While I was there, something happened that I've kept secret for years. My mom worked in Boston, but our family house was about an hour outside the city. It wasn't strange for her to stay in the company apartments when there were deadlines that needed to be met, and that last weekend before Christmas, she had to stay in town. I'd been home for 3 days, so at this point I was settled back in. The sun went down around 5 and it started snowing. Nothing big, just light snow. It was just me and my mom's dog, Ben. I made myself dinner and settled in for a Netflix night. About 2 hours later, my mom called. "Honey, please check on Henry because he's the only one left. Also, lock the doors." Henry was the outdoor cat she had been feeding for the last few weeks. For the local stray cats, my mom had set up a Sterilite with some hay for warmth, and she kept some food and water available, refreshing it nightly, especially when it was freezing outside. They were likely barn cats from nearby that had come through the woods behind my mom's house. But my mom was kind and couldn't say no to an animal in need. As far as she was concerned, they all needed her. I swear she'd love me more if I had 4 legs and a tail. It was snowing harder now. We probably had about 3 inches of snow. I put on my coat and boots and left Ben inside. I saw him go to the couch and settle back down in my warm blankets. I went to the back of the house and found the big gray tub she had set up in the carport of the house. There were no lights in the carport, so I let my eyes adjust to the darkness before I could find the hay. I waited, pulling my coat collar higher around my face when I looked up across the backyard towards the woods. I saw something moving. Whatever it was, it ducked back into the woods before I could even make out a shape. It looked tall, but from my vantage point, the woods were far, and it was pretty dark, despite the falling snow. I watched a little longer and saw nothing change. There was no reason for anybody to be creeping around in the woods behind my mom's house, and I wondered if they had seen me. I hurried and grabbed some hay and threw it blindly into the container. I jumped when I heard a hiss from the box. The cat was already in there. I was so distracted by looking towards the woods that I hadn't even looked. I refreshed the food container and quickly put some snow in the water bowl. I wanted to get back inside fast. I trotted to the front of the house and turned the corner to see Ben sitting outside the closed front door. He was just standing there, wagging his tail at me. I grabbed his collar and pulled him towards the door. "How did you get out here?" I asked him, half expecting him to answer. I shuffled us back inside, wondering how Ben had been able to turn the doorknob. It wasn't a push-down latch, it was the kind you had to grasp and turn. I figured I must have not closed it all the way, and Ben had just nudged it open. I got back into the mess of blankets, onto the couch, and settled in to watch another episode of my show. I must have fallen asleep because the sound of barking woke me up. I looked up to see I was on the Netflix menu page, so my show was over. The barking was frantic, and I jumped off the couch trying to figure out what was happening. It was Ben, and he was barking at the back of the house. I turned on the light in the back hallway and froze when I saw wet footprints on the floor. They led to the living room from the closed back door. There was a large puddle where someone had stopped at the edge of the living room where I had been sleeping. I didn't see any footprints leading anywhere else. They just stopped. I opened the back door, and poor Ben was outside, covered in snow, shaking and barking. He'd been outside for a while. I grabbed him, dragged him into the downstairs bathroom with me, and locked the door. I called the police, and the dispatcher kept me on the line until they arrived. The cops checked the entire house, but found nothing. They asked me if maybe Ben had come in and out of the house without me knowing it, but that wasn't the kind of thing Ben would do. Plus, the steps in my house were big. They didn't look like they were made by a dog. I called my mom and told her what happened. She told me she'd be leaving early and told me to lock all the doors. I heard her car pull up, and then she was in the carport for a few minutes. I ran out to meet her, and I asked her what she was doing. "I had to check on Henry. He's the only one left. Every time it comes, another cat goes missing." The house I grew up in is near an active railroad track. The train is loud, and we were used to it, but the things we heard and saw when the trains weren't running through there were far worse. If you've ever looked down an empty train track, it seems innocuous. But when there's no train, the tracks are an open route for people to use for foot travel or for shady things like drug deals or worse. People have even reported seeing bodies there, but the police never found any bodies. A few years before I was born, there was a train accident about a half-mile from my house. It was a nighttime collision that resulted in 6 deaths. There were rumors that the area was haunted, and as kids, we used to sneak out at night with our flashlights and ghost hunt, and look for crime scenes or bodies. We were weird kids. Of course, this was incredibly dangerous, not only because trains would run through regularly, but also because quite often we'd run into other trespassers, hanging out or sleeping on the edge of the tracks. As kids, we had no business being there, but we went anyway, usually just scaring the hell out of ourselves and telling ghost stories. Until one night. As usual, we told our parents we were spending the night at each other's houses, and I met my friend Tanya at the end of my street before we climbed under the fence into the train tracks. We had a little meeting spot to sit and talk, carved out in the brush against the fence, but not visible from our street. Tanya had a little flashlight for emergencies, but we didn't want anyone to see us, so we rarely used it. That night, we decided to walk the tracks and headed away from our spot. We had walked about a mile when it started to rain. It was the steady kind of rain that seemed like it would last. So we turned around and started heading back. That's when we heard something behind us, something moving fast. The incoming train warning bells and lights were off, so we knew it wasn't a train, but we looked at each other and started running anyway. Looking back, there was only darkness and a deafening roar piercing the air. It was gaining on us, and the sound was all around us. A second later, something roared past us in the night. Nothing we could see, only hear and feel. The ground quaked beneath our feet as a cold rush of air blasted past us. It was a phantom locomotive racing, leaving us crouched down and shaking. We looked at each other, now frozen in place. A second later, we heard a deafening crash, and then everything fell silent, except for the rain hitting the ground and the tracks in front of us. We knew we had just experienced the ghost train. Terrified, we ran all the way back to our spot near the fence. As we approached it, we saw the shapes of some homeless people sleeping near our little hiding spot. I motioned for Tanya to leave them alone, but she had left her bag there, and she needed her keys. We walked quietly around the sleeping figures, and she picked up her backpack. We turned and saw their faces for the first time. They were not alive. These people were mangled and not breathing. Their eyes stared blankly, their faces and bodies destroyed. We ran all the way back to Tanya's house. Now we understood why the police never found any bodies. I used to take the 12B train home from work every evening. My stop is near the end of the line, and usually there are just a handful of people still riding when I reach it. I had been struggling with some issues at the time, both personal and work-related, and I was lost in thought, staring out the window as the train lurched closer to my stop. I was seriously feeling stuck in my job and needed to make a change. 2 stops before mine, an elderly man who was sitting across from me suddenly turned in my direction and smiled. I hadn't been focusing on anyone in particular, but the intensity and directness of his smile couldn't be ignored. I smiled back awkwardly, and he continued to smile at me, and then at other passengers. I pulled out my phone to discourage him and scrolled until I heard my stop announced. I got off the subway and walked to my condo with a clouded head. Indecision was frustrating, and I made myself focus on dinner first. Okay, I decided on spaghetti. I pulled out the ingredients and put some water on to boil. That one decision led to the next one. Right then and there, I decided I was going to send my resume out to find a new job. As the water boiled, I popped open my laptop and quickly updated my resume. I was lost in the job search when I heard the hiss of the water boiling onto the burner. I looked towards my kitchen and saw a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. I live alone and don't have pets. I stood up and waited, listening. I only heard the water hissing on the burner and quickly went to turn it off. I winced as some water bubbled over and splashed onto my hand. I grabbed the biggest knife I had and peered around the corner of the hallway. Of course, there was nothing there, and I laughed at myself for being so jumpy. I made my dinner and felt pretty good about having made the decision to send my resume out. It was well past time for a change, and relocating could be even more exciting. I looked around my condo with fresh eyes and saw the paint cans in the corner. I had bought 2 colors, a dusty green and a sunny yellow, but I'd put off deciding which to use on an accent wall. I'd been feeling so unmotivated and frustrated, but tonight had changed all that. I grabbed the yellow paint and a brush and got to work adding some freshness to the drab space. On my way home the next evening, I still felt excited about the changes I'd made. There's something so freeing about knowing you're potentially in your last few weeks or months of a job that you hate. I had been checking my email on my phone when I realized I was alone on the subway. Alone, except for the old man from the night before. He was smiling at me again. He stood up slowly and walked the length of the subway car to sit in the seat perpendicular to me, just 1 seat away. He kept smiling the whole time. I really didn't want to talk to him, but I also hate confrontation. I desperately wanted my stop to be next. He settled into his seat and leaned towards me, still smiling, motioning for me to lean towards him. I did, and his smile grew. His head turned up towards mine. He was too close, and I wanted to move, but instead I just turned my ear towards him as he started to speak. "I'm sorry I made you burn your hand." Confused, I thought for a second. Then I remembered the pasta water, and yellow was the right choice. It gives you a warm glow when you sleep. I watched as his face became more wrinkled and sallow. His skin was loose and stretching. I turned away to move and felt his hands on my arms, unexpectedly strong. My eyes widened with terror, and there it was, his monstrously large mouth slowly opening, inches from mine. His elongated teeth glinted in the dim, flickering subway light, razor sharp and ready to sink into my flesh. His horrible eyes were fixed on me with a predatory stare. As his teeth tore into my throat, indecision fell away. The world narrowed to a single, clear point. This old man was not a man at all.